Chapter 11, Section 1, Byzantium becomes the new Rome. Now, although historians peg the year 476 as the fall of Rome, it's important to remember that this was not a sudden, drastic event. It was the result of a long process due to political corruption, economic problems, and a really lack of morale, a loss of faith in the stability of their political structure. To some extent, the Romans were caught in a vicious cycle because as the security situation declined, trade and travel became unsafe. That had an economic effect, a declining economy, which means less tax money for the government, which means a declining military situation. And those factors ultimately caused this collapse in the western part of the Roman Empire. Even though rulers like Diocletian tried to stem the tide, tried to address these problems in the 200s. Ultimately, they weren't successful. Renewed civil war, as we know, in the 300s. Constantine eventually triumphs and moves the capital to Byzantium. Well, as the 300s rolled on into the 400s, there was still trouble on the horizon. It took the form of the Huns emerging out of Mongolia, attacking into Europe, and that caused Germanic tribes to cross the Rhine River into the Western Roman Empire. Once they discovered the relative weakness of the Roman military in that area, what started as a trickle turned into a flood, and a full-scale crossing of the border. By 410, Rome was pillaged by Visigoths for the first time in 700 years. By 455, again, a Germanic group, the Vandals, sacked Rome and essentially took over. And by 476, the last emperor, who was a figurehead, a 14-year-old named Romulus Augustus, was removed by the Germanic leader who was actually running things. And that's why historians use 476 as the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, meanwhile, as the 300s rolled on into the 400s and 500s, a succession of Byzantine emperors, I should say, came and went. And one of the most notable was Justinian, who became emperor in 527. Over the course of an almost 40-year rule, Justinian reconquered a lot of the western part of the empire, as you can see here in this map. The dark red color was what he started with, and these tan holdings over here, he restored much of the western part of the empire to the control of Constantinople. That did a lot to stabilize and strengthen the Byzantine Empire during his rule. You can see, though, that major Germanic kingdoms like the Visigoths, the Franks, and the Ostrogoths remained in power in those former Roman territories. One of the keys to Justinian's rule, historians agree, was his wife, Theodora. Now, Theodora's political opponents claimed that she had started out life as a courtesan or a dancer or even a prostitute. However, she rose to a position of prominence, may have been kind of the power behind the throne. She was considered very intelligent, very shrewd, very politically astute, and was a key advisor to Justinian during his turbulent rule, especially during periods of crisis. One of the most notable crises that Justinian had to face was a rebellion in the year 532. It's known as the Nika Rebellion, and it took place at the giant racetrack in Constantinople called the Hippodrome. This picture shows an artist's conception of what the Hippodrome would have looked like during that time. The middle picture is a postcard from the 1950s that shows the open area of the Hippodrome, which still survives in Constantinople. Here's a modern picture of that large oval racetrack, or the remains of it today. Now, In the ancient world, chariot racing was very popular. You can kind of consider it the NASCAR of the ancient world, both in Rome and in Roman cities and in Constantinople. And different teams, known as factiones, it's where we get our word faction from, different teams had different racing colors. And a lot of times these team loyalties reflected political divisions. And so it was more than just a race. In 532, a large riot broke out. According to some historians, Justinian started to panic. He considered fleeing, but it was Theodora who convinced him to hold firm, send in the army, and crush the riot, and that's what happened. Now, in this new Rome, the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, was an absolute ruler. He was also the head of the church, and the Eastern Orthodox Church was the official religion of the empire. While Justinian was in charge, he accomplished several major things, and we're going to look at each one of these in a little bit more detail. The first thing Justinian gets credit for is what's known as the Justinian Code. Its real name was the Body of Civil Law. It had 4 parts: the Codex, the Digest, the Institutes, and the Novels. And Justinian appointed commissions to review, overhaul, and codify the centuries of Roman law that had accumulated. This major legal achievement became the basis of the legal systems of Western Europe, as well as places like Quebec and the state of Louisiana, former French territories that incorporated these principles. And one of the underlying ideas is shown here. The precepts of the law are these: to live honestly, to injure no one, and to give every man his due. Really meaning that the purpose of law is to allow people to live in relative safety and security. And if the law promotes that, it's really good for everybody. Now, the second thing that Justinian is credited for is improving the defenses of the city of Constantinople. You can see on this map that it's sort of a peninsula. And because it was protected on 2 sides by water, it couldn't be surrounded or starved out in a siege. And on the landward side, there were 2 major layers of fortification, here and here. It gave them a defense in depth. These massive walls were difficult to breach. So its location from a military perspective was very sound. The third thing Justinian gets credit for is the building of the Hagia Sophia, a massive church. Hagia Sophia means holy wisdom. It only took 5 years to build. It was a massive construction project. It was the largest dome structure since the Pantheon had been built in Rome. And it was built to echo the architectural glories of Rome. Kind of a statement to the world that, hey, we're still here. Look what we can still do. We're still the Romans, large and in charge. And certainly the Hagia Sophia, the main room shown down here in this photo in the corner, is larger than a football field. This was a stunning architectural achievement. Now, Justinian officially was depicted as being benevolent and religious in a lot of the Byzantine art. But in reality, he may have been a bloodthirsty and tyrannical leader. He probably had to be, because this was a very tough environment in which to rule, in which to hold on to rule. History records that there was frequent assassination of emperors, and in the textbook it talks about how out of 88 emperors, very few of them retired peacefully or died of old age. In fact, the degree of treachery in and around the emperor gave rise to the use of the adjective Byzantine in English, meaning a scary situation where you can't trust anybody, you've got to watch your back. We would think of Stalinist Russia as Byzantine, or North Korea today. The regime of Kim Jong-un is a Byzantine situation. And that's really what life was like for these emperors. You probably had to be really tough and ruthless to stay alive and to hold on to your power. The Byzantine Empire had a lot of problems. They were surrounded by hostile forces. Different strategies. Military use, obviously. They would fight defensive campaigns on land and sea. One of their key naval weapons was flamethrowers. They invented something called Greek fire, some sort of mixture of pine and tar and other flammable materials. Historians aren't sure what it consisted of, but it allowed them to dominate at sea. Sometimes they would use diplomacy. They would make deals. They would buy off invaders. They would marry Byzantine princesses to potential hostile invaders to make a deal, keep the peace. When they became seriously under pressure from the Islamic armies pressing on their borders in the 1100s, they ultimately asked their Western European Christian cousins for help in a series of events known as the Crusades. The plague also was a major challenge, killing 75% of the people who got it. And obviously this has a very negative effect on the economy, on the military situation, and on the morale of the people. Another major issue for the Byzantines was that they lived in a tough neighborhood, and they were surrounded by hostile forces that over time closed in on the empire. In the 600s, they battled the Persians and the Avars to their east. In the later 600s, a new enemy appeared from the south as Islam grew out of the Arabian Peninsula and spread, and that continued into the next century. Also, from the northeast, Russians and Turks began pressing in on the Byzantine borders. A couple centuries of conflict with the forces of Islam resulted in the Crusades, and in 1204, Christian knights from Western Europe, who allegedly came to help the Byzantines, wound up looting the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. As the centuries rolled by, the empire began to lose territory. Ultimately, in the year 1453, Constantinople was conquered by the Turks, and the city was renamed Istanbul. This is a famous painting by French painter Eugene Delacroix, and it shows the entry of the Crusaders into Constantinople. Scenes of mayhem here in the background, rape and pillage. In the foreground here, Byzantine folks in Constantinople are begging for their lives from these Christian knights that allegedly came to help them. This slide shows a medieval tapestry depicting the fall of Constantinople. And the Turks were able to conquer the city despite its defenses because ultimately they were able to move some of their naval craft and bypass some of the Byzantine naval defenses. The big factor was gunpowder and the use of cannon that rendered the large walls obsolete. And in the lower panel it shows here the entry of Ottoman troops into Constantinople. They conquered the city. This map shows the shrinkage of the Byzantine Empire over time. At its height under Justinian and his reconquest of the West, as you can see, Byzantine Empire, a lot of territory. But as the centuries rolled by, increasing pressure, shrinking down by the year 1360 to a small, this dark purple area, some territory in Greece as well. Ultimately, in 1453, it goes under. Now, although the Western Empire fell, and ultimately the Byzantine Empire fell, Christianity survived. When the Roman Empire in the West collapsed, the only institution to survive was the Roman Catholic Church, headed by the Pope, who's also the Bishop of Rome. One of the Pope's titles today is the Pontiff, and that's another reference to ancient Rome. The High Priest of Jupiter was called the Pontifex Maximus, which means the greatest bridge builder, the idea that the high priest was the bridge between the Roman people and the gods. And similarly, for Roman Catholic Christians, the Pope serves that purpose. Christianity split in the early Middle Ages permanently into two broad versions, and you can see the textbook lists the main doctrinal differences between them. Doctrine is a word which means beliefs and practices. And one of the significant ones was essentially a political difference. In Western Europe in the Middle Ages, popes claimed that they had authority over kings, whereas in the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine emperor was clearly in charge. This tension between popes and kings in Western Europe was a constant theme in the Middle Ages. This chart shows, again, just another listing of the two religions and their doctrinal differences. Overall, though, they're essentially based on exactly the same beliefs. Now, one of the key features of Orthodox Christianity is the use of icons, religious images of the key figures in Christianity. These were very popular. Occasionally, some Byzantine rulers suppressed the use of icons because they considered it a form of idol worship. And at one point there was a political controversy where the army was ordered to round up and destroy icons. This word iconoclast literally means icon breaker. And today an iconoclast is somebody who destroys traditions. Ultimately, the use of icons was allowed to continue. Icons became a major facet of Byzantine art. Most Byzantine art is religious in nature, highly decorative, mosaics, icons, Christian crucifixes, and other symbols of the religion rendered in gold and precious jewels, etc. The Orthodox religion is a major facet of Christianity. It survives today in various Orthodox churches around the world. The Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Armenian Orthodox Church are a couple examples. So the thing to remember about Chapter 11, Section 1 is that Constantinople ruled over an Eastern Empire that survived for another 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And it matters today because Orthodox Christianity is a major branch of modern Christianity.